podcasts as I normally do, but there are several reasons for this. Most of them, I have to say, connected with money, but partially also because of my own ill health recently. I'm just recovering at the moment from a very long-term lung infection, and thanks to my GP and the excellent Scottish NHS, I now have the antibiotics, which are basically improving my situation, curing what's wrong with me. So I'm back and firing on all cylinders today. Now, I was talking with Norrie Hunter from Caledon Media recently about the contents of Friday morning's programme of Hodna Jacket and what we were going to talk about. So I thought today, just as a kind of taster, an appetizer, if you like, for Friday, I would begin to outline some of the problems which will face the newly independent Scotland as it emerges into a rapidly changing and very chaotic global political situation. As we're all aware, Donald Trump's recent rather random and I would have to say arbitrary tariffs that he's been placing on other countries, and which appear to have been generated by ChatGPT rather than actually any economists or politicians particularly. These arbitrary tariffs have done several things, and these things will be important to Scotland going forward. But the most important one, I think, of all, is that Trump sees the European Union as an enemy, as an adversary in terms of both trade and in the national power politics of the various regions of the planet. Now, the European Union, as you know, is huge, right? It has, at the moment, I think 28 member states, and its combined wealth and its economic power vastly outstrips that of the United States. And this is why Donald Trump doesn't like it. And he is trying deliberately to destroy all current trade arrangements with the EU, which he sees as somehow harming the United States. However, let me explain what this is about. Trump is trying to split the European Union into individual countries by putting these huge tariffs on the EU in general, and then waiting to do deals with individual countries. He's hoping to divide and conquer Europe individually, one state at a time. The European Union has said, don't do it. It's told all of its members not to do individual deals with Donald Trump. And so the European Union is standing very solidly. Now, I only mention this because this is going to have a direct bearing on Scotland's future after it has been liberated from its prison of the UK. Now, while I'm talking about being liberated, it's come to my attention in the last few days that some polls have been published which show the level of support, not just in Scotland for independence, but also in Wales and Northern Ireland. And the figures actually make very sobering reading if you're in charge of the UK, because in Wales particularly, support for independence has shot up to 41%. In Northern Ireland, I think it's actually even higher than that. And so the peoples of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are not confident about remaining in the United Kingdom given the current global political and I think you'd have to say trade situation going forward at the moment. The chaos that Donald Trump has actually created across the globe, I think, is designed to make all these other countries want to do deals individually with Donald Trump. And this is something we as a nation need to be very careful not to fall into, because this is an obvious trap. However, the interesting thing about the political situation is it's driving support for independence upwards, not just in Scotland, but in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Now, that's going to sound alarm bells in Whitehall, who are desperate to keep the UK together, and especially to keep Scotland tethered to England, because, as we know, Scotland is the cash cow of the United Kingdom. It is the money supply. It is the thing that generates capital through its oil revenues, its gas revenues, whiskey revenues, and all of the other things which Scotland is famous for producing. However, we don't see any benefit for it. By remaining in the United Kingdom, we don't even get 8% of the potential benefits of our oil, our gas, our whiskey revenues, our food exports and all the rest of it. We just don't see it. And we don't see it for a very good reason, and that's because it's all going south to London to pay to keep the UK creaking along. Now, we know that the UK is kind of on its last legs at the moment, and so there's never been a better time to plan ahead. So what I'm going to look at today is how Scotland needs to reconfigure its economy to cope with the new circumstances. Now, the first thing I would say here is that if we take what's happening in America to be a continuing trend, in other words, countries pulling up the shutters and going full protectionist, in other words, trying to protect their own industries, trying to make it very expensive for anyone in their country to buy imports. America is going to suffer for that because Americans are going to pay the tariffs. It's not the companies that it's not the nations that Trump is aiming at who are paying the tariffs. It's the people who would normally buy the products from those countries who pay the tariffs. So we don't want any tariffs ourselves. But I would say the first thing we need to do, and this is in some degree actually something which Trump has not done right, but accidentally done right, and that would be to separate the domestic from, shall we say, the international trade activities of the country. Now, what I mean by that is that the first act of a newly independent Scottish government will have to be to protect the population, to see to their needs first. Now, that means nationalising a segment, not all of it, but a segment of the most important utilities. Now, that means that the utilities in Scotland, that is oil, gas, heat, light, power, everything that people need in their daily lives to actually live, needs to be at a cost that we can all afford. Now, this is something that can be done by a partial nationalisation of bits of the utility network, for example, the national grid, and also, for example, the capacity to generate power for the national grid. And if anything, the war in Ukraine has proved is that energy networks are uniquely vulnerable to damage by bad foreign actors, people bombing you or sending drones to blow up your power stations or your power infrastructure. So one of the things I think we need to do is to generate more of our own electricity ourselves at home. More solar panels need to go on roofs, and there needs to be a more decentralized national grid system which produces power in thousands of locations instead of just 5 or 6 big nuclear power stations or gas-fired power stations or whatever. The more smaller feed-ins that we have from these local areas, the more robust the power system will be, and it will last for centuries, and it will be dependable. That's one thing. And so nationalising the power grid system and introducing, shall we say, a secondary grid within that for home power generation would be a big step to making that sustainable. Second thing is we need a stable food supply. We need to be able to farm and produce enough food for everybody here first. And that's again about sustainability, producing food at a cost that people can afford. And again, not a complete nationalisation, but a national agency whose task it is to make sure that farmers are making a reasonable living and that their produce can be sold for a reasonable margin that will keep them in business and also be affordable to the population. That's something else we need to do. Added on to that is the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, and the heating systems and the insulation in our homes. These things all also need to be nationalised, and the schemes put in place that will make sure that we're using as little energy as possible, and the energy that we do receive is affordable, unlike what it is at the moment. And then by doing this and splitting off the domestic supply of these vital utilities to make sure that the public can afford them on the wages and the salaries that we currently have, will mean that the country can continue to not just survive, but to gradually expand and have its economy begin to grow a bit in a sustainable way, in a planned way, so that it's not just chaotic, and also in a way that plans for what happens when not the oil runs out, but when the amount of renewable energy and the new concepts, the new means of, for example, driving vehicles and heating homes without using oil and gas have actually been put in place, because there's going to be a balancing act between those two things to be achieved. That needs an energy commission with experts on it who know how to do that. So having said all of this, I think it's evident that Scotland needs to have a domestic economy set up first. And that means doing deals with private companies at the moment so that a segment of their production is ring-fenced entirely for the domestic population at cost, or as near as cost possible, so that that is affordable. Anything above and beyond that, we can do a deal with those companies to say, well, anything that you export, which is not in this domestic utilities sector, you can charge what you like for that, and you can export it wherever you wish, to whomever you want, and we will simply charge your corporation tax as we normally do, and we might even give you a better rate, especially if you increase the wages of your employers or you hire more employees. So there are ways in which we can help industries to export more, and we will do that anyway. We can also offer them some inducements by lowering particular taxes that make it easier for them to export, and also encourage them to employ more people or to raise wages, or both. All of these things can be done, and all of these things should be done by any competent government. Now that leaves us with the problem of foreign trade, and given the current chaotic circumstances caused by Donald Trump, we need to look at this a little bit more carefully. So what I suspect will probably happen, and this is just my guess, is that given the chaos in the global markets at the moment, it would make zero sense for us to start actually applying tariffs to imports. Because if you start to do that, then the countries that you want to do business with will apply tariffs to your imports as well. And that is something which would push the price of Scottish goods up too high and would stop those exports from happening. So offering free trade agreements should become a habit, because really what we want to do is trade freely with lots of different people on the same zero terms. In other words, no taxes, just the cost of shipping is basically what we're talking about here. The cost of transporting whatever it is to wherever it needs to go. Whether that be electricity or gas or timber or meat or whatever it is, anything physical like that needs to go where it's going. And paying taxes on that is going to reduce the amount that can be exported. Now you'll be asking, right, okay, so if all of these Scottish firms are exporting all this stuff, where is the income going to come from for the Scottish economy? And the answer to that is simply through business taxation. Rather than lumbering businesses with extra tariffs and duties which have to be paid on stuff going out or in, we simply tax the businesses, and this creates a much simpler tax structure. Any exporting or importing business will pay a corporation tax on their profits, and that can be adjusted to reflect how much or how little they are importing or exporting. If, for example, they're only dealing with the domestic market, then their business taxes could be much lower, simply because they are providing a service for the people rather than making profits as being the primary mover. If a segment of their production is going into this domestic market, then that would not necessarily be taxed at the same rate. Why should it be? Because they're doing that to help the internal economy, and therefore maybe that shouldn't be taxed at all. However, what they export needs to be taxed fairly. And if we start putting tariff barriers in the way, that is going to increase the costs of both production, it's going to increase the cost of export and make it more difficult to trade. So the fewer rules there are about exporting and importing, the better. But that doesn't mean we don't check stuff, because anything coming or going, as Norrie and I discussed recently on the issue of hard borders, needs to be checked. And that means physical goods coming and going across and into our ports needs to be checked on a random basis all the time. And that means more customs officers to do that. Where does the money come from for that? Well, that needs to come from general taxation of the businesses which are importing or exporting. So a section of that taxation needs to be ring-fenced entirely for that purpose. What I'm saying here is that the way the government of the future Scotland needs to act is it needs to segment its economy into clearly defined areas, some of which will not be taxed because they're internal, some of which will be taxed because they have to be in order to get some kind of return from what we're basically giving these companies, which is a much easier method of export and import. Having done all of that, the trade balance does not matter so much. What matters is the bottom line, what the companies are making, how much taxation we're getting, and how little taxation needs to be paid on the internal market production. Remember that people who don't have to pay high energy bills, who don't have to pay high food bills, are going to have more money to spend on other luxuries which can either be imported or manufactured here. So the economies come from removing some of the barriers which aren't necessary and putting in place guarantees for the internal market, in other words, for our domestic customers. We look after ourselves first, and we encourage our businesses who are exporting to do so as freely as possible, so that the tax income is coming from those corporations. Now, you could say that if you gave the businesses a much lower rate of tax, if they employed more people, and if they paid those people more, then the tax take would then come from income taxes instead. And that is something for economists to work out what that balance should be. Either way, both of these mixes might work. But essentially, I think my message today is, having thought about this for quite a while, the geopolitics is shifting dramatically, and if Trump continues down this road, America is going to be completely paralyzed for perhaps a decade as a result of the damage he's doing to his own country, and it may not be possible to put it right quickly. And that would leave us looking for trade partners who do have the buying power that we need and who don't put up trade barriers, and that would be the EU. And before you say to me, oh, well, we don't want to get out of one union and join another, I'm not proposing that we join the EU. Simply that we join the European Free Trade Association, which will allow us to trade into and out of Europe without tariffs or taxes, with the usual customs checks that we always do, the veterinary checks and the hygiene checks on the food and produce coming and going. All of this would continue as normal. We'd also have free travel into and out of Europe, so the tourist business in Scotland would benefit, the tourist businesses in Europe would benefit, and you could live and work in Europe if you wanted to. So there are a lot of benefits in doing this way, and the European Free Trade Association gives us back what was lost during Brexit, but without the onerous business of having to be a full EU member. So long as our basic laws, our standards, our levels of corruption, our economy, and most importantly of all, our own currency is stable, then the EU will trade with us happily. And that's 28 countries that we can trade with like that, just simply by joining the European Free Trade Association. That opens the doors for us to revitalise our ports, our airports, and all our other infrastructure so that we can trade with our near neighbours, which is the most obvious place for our exports to go, because that's the cheapest place to get them to, and it's the biggest market. It's bigger than the US. We don't do a huge amount of trade with the US. We export whiskey and certain foodstuffs and maybe some wool products to the US, high value, low volume. That could still continue, but that would be one trade deal with the US, just one, and it would be open-ended. We don't want to start putting tariffs and barriers in the way of our trading partners abroad. We want to make it easy for them and easy for us. We mustn't fall into the trap of trying to restart the economy based on a Victorian model of low wages, high productivity, because we know that's a step back. This is what Trump's trying to do to the States. He's trying to basically trash the globalized economy completely and restart America building new factories to manufacture cheap goods with cheap labor. And that will involve lots of Mexicans and other poorly paid immigrants doing the work, which is currently done by people in places like China and Taiwan. Now, even in China and Taiwan, wages are rising and the costs of production are going to increase. And so the world is going to be finding a new balance somewhere. So Scotland needs to have some production, not necessarily automated. There are a lot of things which cannot be made by machines, and in fact a lot of high value goods must be made by human beings, otherwise they don't have a high value. We're talking about crafts here, we're talking about knitwear, we're talking about furniture, wooden products. kit houses made from timber, anything like that, which has to have a long, strong human involvement in manufacturing. Those are the types of industries that we want to develop, not a low-wage, slave-wage economy with sweatshops, as is apparently the plan that Donald Trump has. But Scotland has the ability to do all of these things, and we have the smart people who are able to make the kind of decisions necessary, first of all, to protect the internal economy and to make sure that Scotland is a stable, self-sustaining economy with everything that people need at a price they can afford before anything else is done. After that, the businesses in Scotland can make decisions about exporting. And our government, having already sequestered the domestic market and done deals with manufacturers of electricity, the suppliers of gas or oil or petrol, whatever else we need, having already done a deal with them for the domestic market, that leaves us able to do negotiation with them on how much we may or may not tax their profits on their exports. And so there are ways around all of these things, but I think we have to look after ourselves first, make sure the Scottish economy and everybody living here is living in affordable housing as well. Housing is a problem which crops up over and over again in Scottish political discourse, and it's never solved. It should be solved, and it can be paid for if we divide the nation up like this into, if you like, domestic utility and overseas exports and surpluses. Those are the things we trade with. The things that we need to keep are the things that give people homes, give them the electricity, the gas, the petrol, the food, the water, everything else that they need at an affordable price. Housing has to be top of the list, though. There isn't enough of it, as we know. There aren't enough jobs either, as we know, for young people. And so the jobs need to be created as a part of this process. And I think a construction industry is one area you could do that. By expanding the construction industry and including it in the domestic supply grouping, if you like, we can do deals with house construction companies to build houses that actually fit into the environments that they're built in. Not these crackerbox, breeze block and plasterboard efforts that you see springing up everywhere, but houses built, say, in the Highlands, the Western Isles, in the lochs and around the lochs and glens of Scotland, that are made from stone and slate and timber and fit into the architecture and fit into the environment where they're being built, that people want to live in and at a price that they can afford to pay. And I'm not talking rental. I think land prices have skyrocketed because Scotland has no control over any of its land and what it costs. And that's something else which needs to be nationalised urgently. And parcels of building land should be available to members of the public who want to self-construct. Because if you buy a kit house that you can put up in 10 days with a small team, that's going to save you a fortune. But you need the land to build it on. So the cost of land and the cost of production of houses needs to be dealt with as an urgent domestic supply issue. And it's probably the biggest domestic supply issue that we face. And that is one thing that we must focus on right from the beginning. Have enough housing for everybody who lives here. Have enough jobs for the young people who live here as well. And that will help, especially for constructing thousands of new houses which fit into their environment and look right and are made from construction materials that are appropriate to where they are actually built. So villages look nice, they fit in with the architecture around them, the villages expand, townships and settlements look right, and they're no longer abandoned and left derelict as they have been for centuries. Anyway, I think I've rambled on long enough, but I think you begin to see the picture, the urgency of the things that we have to deal with when we do free ourselves from the Union. But the key thing, I think, is to separate the urgent tasks of the domestic economy and deal with them first. After that, we can do deals with the companies for what they export, and that will produce income on a steady stream. The internal economy will be healthy, everybody will have somewhere to live, everybody will have enough money to spend on stuff which they need, which they can't afford at the moment. And also, because we're connected with Europe, our tourist industry will flourish. And that is something which concerns everybody who lives in rural Scotland. That's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. If you have any comments, as usual, you can leave them in the comments section on the programme. If you want to contact me, the details are also there as well. And if you'd like to donate, I've put a link in the description. So please help me continue making content like this. I'll see you all again on Friday morning at 9:30 with Norrie Hunter in the next edition of Hod Majaket, where we'll have a look in more detail at some of this stuff and other things which have cropped up in the political sphere in Scotland through the last week. So that's it from me today. I'll see you all again soon. Remember to keep the faith, and hopefully things will get better. The weather's fantastic at the moment. Let's get out and enjoy it. And remember, be optimistic. There's a great future ahead for Scotland. All we have to do is make sure it happens. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.